Good morning, Revolution, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to our show. I'm joined this morning by Brooklyn, Bobby, and David. Thanks for joining us. And this morning we're going to talk about how to make Marxist theory, our presentation of Marxist theory, clear and powerful, and why that's important. But first, just kind of checking in with people. Um, Brooklyn, you're in the Brooklyn Club. So I heard a rumor that under communism, you're not even allowed to have your own name. You just have to use the name of your club. Is that true?
I guess apparently
I guess
happy to share
that's
though.
that's what I get for listening to MSNBC, I guess. And David, you are in a club called the Mike Gold Club, right? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the Mike Gold Collective is part of the Anahas Morgan Club in Columbus, Ohio, and so yeah, we're a group of writers and workers and labor activists, all in Columbus. Some in the party, some outside, and yeah, the idea is to develop, pieces of journalism reporting on things happening here in Ohio, but also more broadly to develop working class media for every outlet that we can get ourselves into.
Thank you. And Bobby, you've been working in sort of the party's press for a long time. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the roles you've had with the People's World and in the party's ideological work?
Yes, I guess my ideological work, I guess, started a long time before I started writing for the People's World. I guess I'd like to say my ideological work started at work, talking to my fellow workers and trying to figure out how to talk about the things I learned or understood from the party and how to make that real to workers given our real situation. I've also been a labor editor for People's World, and my most fun projects have been writing pamphlets and articles that I think are trying to be popularizing difficult concepts.
Yeah, and you wrote that terrific pamphlet, Marxism in the Age of Amazon and Uber, right? Check it out, folks, if you haven't. And Brooklyn, can you tell us a little bit about your um, ideological work as well? And I know you do a lot of work with video and social media. Can you tell us a little about your approach?
Yeah, so when I'm making videos, I try to keep in that popular approach in mind, trying to make things, comprehensive and getting to the key points of the discussion. I make a lot of the social media videos for GMR. And so I always try to highlight the key ideas so that people will begin to be curious about researching into the depth of those ideas more on their own free time. My history in ideological work, I guess, I'm an artist, so I'm always thinking about, bigger structures and systems when I'm making art or create using my creative ideas, whether that be through acting or painting. Um, and I try to apply those same ideas when I'm making my social media content.
Oh, thank you. So we've got a really good spread of different sort of fronts of yeah of ideological and theoretical work here. That's terrific. I guess to kind of introduce the topic and its importance, I wanted to share a bit from the history of our party. Um, so in the 1940s, the leader of the party, early 40s, the leader of the party at the time, Earl Browder, kind of went a little off the rails and seemed to have sort of lost faith in the leading role of the working class and the centrality of class struggle as a force for social change. And he ended up pushing some really non-Marxist ideas and eventually dissolving the party and refounding it as the Communist Political Association. And the top leadership of the party at the time, may have had misgivings, but they went along with this. So when that ended and when the party was reconstituted, the top leadership at a special national committee meeting sort of spoke up about why they went along with something that they you know, didn't think was a great idea. And one of them was Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a legendary labor organizer who'd been in the workers' movement for practically her entire life. And she said, listen, I knew what Browder was doing was wrong because I couldn't explain it to workers. And yet, there were all these men who knew so much more about Marxism than I do, and they seemed to agree with it. So I didn't think it was my place to speak up, right? And that sort of, I think, exposes um, some of what happens when our theoretical culture is not um, accessible, not inclusive, and not handled correctly. Um, so maybe starting with Brooklyn, theory. The word sort of it gets a bad rap. What are some of the things that people associate with the term theory?
Well, I mean, I'll speak for myself here. When I first started getting, I joined the party 3.5 years ago, and before that, I had done very minimal reading. And I'll say one of the biggest things that I associated with theory was just this big feeling of intimidation. And I still, as much reading as I've done now, I know that I haven't done enough. So that intimidation and that fear of not saying the right thing, I feel like is always kind of holding me back a little bit. But I think one of the biggest things that I've learned is having like a curiosity about theory that has allowed me to open my mind to not feel that pressure so much. Because that little anecdote that you gave about Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is something that I feel like I relate to so much, not feeling confident enough to speak on something. But at the same time, realizing that myself and everybody else who's working class has something to contribute to the conversation, even if we haven't necessarily read all of the theory. So when it comes to theory, it's very important, and I've learned a lot from it. But I think there is this kind of intimidation with it that it shouldn't be, because it's really a guide to how we can apply what we learn, and and what we can apply to our work. Um, so yeah, I hope I explained that.
Yeah, no,
Really.
that's great, and I felt that too, that intimidation. Even in graduate school, studying literature and literary theory, there were always people around who seemed like they had read everything and they knew like all the like they could summarize all the major works and all the authors and every philosopher, and it just felt like how can I get into that conversation? And the theoretical culture of the party is very different than that, I think, and in a good way. But so thinking about the language we use in our theory, beyond expressing our thoughts, language sends messages about who our audience is, who we are talking to, who we want to bring into the conversation, and also who we want to exclude. David, who's the target audience for our ideological work, our theory?
Yeah, I think it's got to be as broad as possible and inclusive of the entire working class. So that means thinking about these complex ideas and theory. That means communicating your ideas in a way that people can understand the core of what you're getting to, regardless of how much theoretical background they have. These theory concepts are kind of building blocks, and in some ways they are essential to understanding, but that doesn't mean that we can't find ways. We need to find ways to communicate our ideas that are accessible to the broadest possible audience. So it's kind of our task, to break those concepts down and communicate them simply and clearly, and to be inclusive, so that everybody can participate in the conversation. Because these aren't, when we write, when we generate media, this isn't a one-way conversation of us delivering piece of theory or an idea, from on high. It is a two-way thing that the people who read it have an opportunity to build on it and expand on it and put it into practice. So it has to be very accessible to the broadest diversity of people and experiences and theoretical levels as possible.
And just to put you on the spot a little bit more, could you give us an example from your own work, writing maybe for the PW or in other areas where you've really worked to try and get the essence of something across in a way that's clear, whether or not it was
Yeah,
successful?
yeah. So some of my favorite pieces that the Mike Gold Collective has worked on are when we go and talk to workers themselves, and really the article writes itself. If you spend enough time with the workers, I'm thinking of a piece we did on the UAW stand up strike a couple years ago up in Toledo. We spent the day on the picket line in Toledo, just kind of hanging out with workers and talking to them. And if you're listening over the course of the day, the things people say perfectly describe the situation in direct terms that anybody can relate to. So the really then is just a matter of editing, right? Taking all these little scraps, bits of things that people said and how the people who are there participating in events are experiencing them, taking that and putting it together in a concise 600-word article that everybody else who's not there that day in Toledo can read. Um, so I think it works best when we put we're just a medium for what the workers are already saying. You're just editing and condensing and consolidating the thoughts that are already out there. And I think what we learned that day on the picket line is that the level of theoretical understanding among working people is much higher than many other areas of the media we give people credit for.
That sort of thank you. That sort of leads into my next question. So, in capitalist culture, there's this idea that working class equals uneducated, ignorant, uninterested in ideas. Except very narrow questions about wages, maybe or benefits. Um, Obviously, we're a working class party. All of us here are working class people. Um, how do we? So, Bobby, what's your experience of the intellectual life of the working class? David, painted a really different picture than what capitalist culture kind of gives us. So,
Well, Scott, everybody has theory. Every person, every human has a theory about how the world works. Um, and I think so. Nobody owns theory. Nobody in the Communist Party owns it either. Um, I think our challenge is to engage people in conversations where we can help each other understand more about how the world works, because that's how we're going to be able to change it. So I've had the most interesting conversations with people actually at work, whether it's, I worked in a sewage treatment plant 100 feet underground in a sewer talking about something, or in a steel mill at break time. I think anybody who's been in a work lunchroom knows the intense conversations that happen over theoretical questions. For example, what is working class? That's a struggle going on right now. Is working class, does that mean like a white guy in a hard hat, only by himself? Or does it mean all of the people who don't own any means of production? So those kind of discussions can be had without invoking the term proletarian or bourgeois or right opportunism or any other kind of jargon. We can talk about uh, the labor theory of value and give people that tool. I think how it is that capitalists make
oh,
the, the terms capital.
someone's trying to censor you, Bobby.
I see that. Yes, I'm not. No, I am not in the well of a steel mill right now, if that's what you think that is. So anyway, I think more than teaching theory, what we can do is engage people in conversations and incorporate, just as David was telling us, some of the people's concrete experiences. I think folks learn a lot more if our challenge is to connect those concrete experiences with broader theoretical concepts of Marxism so that people can get an understanding of where the power in this society lies and how they can wield it.
Thank you.
So, can I just add one
I'm
other?
sorry. Oh yeah,
The
by all means.
most gratifying experiences I've had in conversations was when you see a light go off in somebody's head and they suddenly realize, oh, that's how they make the money. I was on an assembly line. We're making vendors for cars, and we were 10 people were producing 20 vendors per hour, and then they sell them for $1,000 each, and we only get paid so much. And while you're bored on the line, you're doing the math in your head and figuring out how much they're making off of each of you. I think that's a easier way to understand Marxism than in a way that's very abstract. So workers have an advantage, really, in understanding theory taken from their practical life.
Thank you. And that concreteness is really, really important. As much as using like clear language, I think keeping things concrete is you know, as both Bobby and David had suggested, um, rooted in people's actual experiences, because that's where the theory comes from, and that's what it's meant to explain. When we think about theory, like Bobby said, theory, everyone theorizes. Theory just means finding a pattern that explains things and identifying it. Everyone does it. It's part of what we do as human beings. So, thinking of these ideas that have come out, the importance of discussion between workers, the importance of reflecting on our actual experiences. Um, that's, I feel like workplaces aren't always friendly to that, or like many areas of our culture are not friendly to that kind of thing. And I was wondering if maybe all of our panelists or anyone who wants to could sort of talk about some of the obstacles, some of the features of working class life under capitalism that make our collective theoretical work difficult. Um,
There's sort of this rule, that horrible rule that, oh, we don't discuss politics, we don't discuss religion, and that's rude. Uh, I think we can break that down if we approach it from a different uh, angle, because all of us are working with people, good people, decent people who have horrible political outlooks. So, how do we deal with that? We have to start with the human and the personal, and have conversations like that. And I think let people build the ideas out of their, rather than going in as debate sessions. Uh, so I think that's a real challenge, and but we have to win over our entire working class. Let me
Absolutely.
just add to that, Scott. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Part of that, I think, is how we talk in group, like here or in our meetings. We're already modeling language for people, for our members. We have lots of new members and people who follow us, and they agree with our ideas. They're looking at how we speak, and they're going to speak that way to other workers. So if we are full of jargon like neoliberal and right wing opportunism and things that people don't understand naturally, then that's going to be picked up. So I think those of us who are in groups, even in our clubs, need to model language that's accessible to everyday workers. It doesn't mean dumb language, but why would you say bourgeois when you could say capitalist? And everybody knows what a capitalist is. Bourgeois has a lot of different meanings.
All right. We're going to maybe come back to that question of whether everybody knows what capitalist uh, is. But Brooklyn, do you have any thoughts on what makes it difficult for us to engage in this collective work of theory?
Yeah. I kind of want to piggyback off of what Bobby was saying about this kind of unspoken rule about not speaking about politics, because I do feel like that is an unspoken rule, but at the same time, people a lot of the time are talking about political things without even knowing it, I feel like, or they're not thinking of it in a political way. Like one example I can give is when I was a waitress right before the shift starts, everybody's in the back, the line cooks and all the waitresses, we're all like updating each other about what's going on in our lives. And there was this one time where a line cook was just complaining that, you know, he has to pay for everything. His girlfriend never pays for anything. And how he thinks that that's unfair and all of this stuff. And, you know, some line cooks are chiming in like, well, that's what you're supposed to do. You're a man. And some of the girls are commenting like, well, I have to pay for makeup, so he should have to pay for dinner. And you know, everybody is kind of really engaged and interested in this very political conversation that is connected to these very big systems, to capitalism, to patriarchy, to all of these things that, you know, all of us are very invested in. And I think, you know, I think that's a way that we can kind of, as communists or as Marxists, we can start to let them realize that they are talking about politics, but and we can do it in this kind of collective way where we're all kind of listening to each other and understanding where everybody's coming from. So I think, you know, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and recognizing political discussions outside of the framework that the capitalist class tries to give for them, which is you're talking about parties and you're talking about candidates, and so yeah, recognizing those occasions is key. David?
Yeah, I really like what both Brooklyn and Bobby had said about this kind of unspoken or even sometimes spoken rule about no politics at work, no politics at the dinner table, that sort of thing. I wanted to build off of that, thinking about the workplace specifically, that there's kind of this feeling or some, you know, a rule of who's qualified to speak and who isn't, you know, and this using titles, using positions or even education as a way of determining, you know, whose opinions are valid in a discussion and whose aren't. We see this a lot in the capitalist workplace culture, and it's part of the intentional divide and rule strategy of who's allowed to have input on how the workplace is run and who isn't. Um, and so what you end up with in practice are these meetings where management can say whatever they want with impunity, and workers, you know, are kind of cowed and cautious, and they probably know very well what needs to change and what the problems are, but there's no environment where they can share that without being, you know, punished for it. So yeah, who's qualified to speak and who isn't is something that, you know, also can show up sometimes in our organizing work. People, you know, might think that, well, I'm new here to the party or I'm new to the movement, and you know, I have some ideas, but I'll just sit back. And those are barriers that we need to overcome, because really everybody, you know, whether it's your first day or you've been here 10 years, you know, should feel completely free to contribute to the conversation.
And the conversation needs those contributions. Um,
Exactly.
and I just add on what makes it difficult. You know, thinking about my own experience when I was teaching in Chicago in the Chicago public schools, um, there was a lot of stuff to talk about in terms of what was going on, the attacks at that time from a mayor's office that was much less friendly to the teachers union and everything. But we were so busy, there was never any time to talk about it. And then outside of work, our lives are, you know, we're constantly going. So and doing that work of making sense of the world collectively and figuring out how to talk about it, it takes a lot of time, and that's something that capitalism affords less and less of, I think, for us. Um, but looking, so we were some very good points about, you know, there are certain terms that are just unnecessarily complex. But kind of thinking from the other side here, we talk about a scientific approach to socialism, right? It's not just, you know, whatever we happen to feel or think. There's an idea that there's a body of concepts, of ideas that make sense of the world in a way that allows us to change it. So we can replace bourgeoisie with capitalist, means the same thing, but stuff like surplus value, labor power, um, a nation versus a nationality, uh, opportunism, as Bobby mentioned, aren't they, in a certain sense, part of a technical vocabulary that describe necessary things that we need to talk about? I mean, nobody's out there telling biologists to, find a less jargony way, a word for chromosome, right? So how do we? What's the balance? Like, is there a technical vocabulary? Yeah,
I,
Bobby, take it away.
Yeah, so I agree. We need a technical vocabulary, but that means if there's the word represents a concept, just like chromosome is a thing. It needs to be explained what it is and what role it plays. So if we're talking about surplus value, then we can't just throw it in a sentence. It just it deserves at least a paragraph to say, well, there is this idea that how much the workers produce over and above, what they take to live off of is a concept and explain the concept. And that means that in every conversation, even though people don't necessarily absorb the whole thing at one time, it becomes a common thing. But if you have a sentence with 6 different terms like that without explanation, then I don't think they're useful. So a term like that needs to be discussed. People aren't uh, just a skull that you open up and pour information into. People don't. We don't. That's not how humans learn. We learn by playing with ideas and manipulating them and so on. So if we want to talk about surplus value, then that's a whole conversation. Um, you know, I'm taken with the concept of the term working class. When I was growing up, working class was almost like a radical. You didn't call yourself working class. That was too radical. People were middle class, and then it kind of evolved into, oh, now we talk about working families. That was a little less sharp, but now everybody's working class. And so and now I think that so idea terms can also become part of the popular understanding if if people's experience deserves that.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like there's a sort of struggle to kind of introduce the terms for the things we're talking about and the correct understanding of those. And working class is a really good example because it has changed really significantly in the past, um, even over the past 10 years. Like everybody was 10 years ago, no mainstream political forces were talking about the working class at all. Even in labor, I feel like people are
They
talking
talked about the 99%, any kind of euphemism that you could have. But I'm sorry to butt in again. But so what we're really fighting for isn't just the term, it's the concept.
yeah.
And I would apply that to all of the other, if we think a concept is important to understand, then it's not just the term we're fighting for. Sorry, Scott.
No, that's an excellent point. That's because that's what we're doing. Like um, capitalist culture tries to distort and prevent people from understanding the world in a way that is favorable to their own interests. So I guess that brings me to kind of we've been using this term ideological work, and I now realize it's just a habit to use that term, and it's an extremely jargony term, in fact. So, Brooklyn, what is ideological work when we talk about that? What does it consist of?
I think ideological work consists of like recognize well I guess for me ideology is kind of like the base of ideas through which we're trying to move things. It kind of has an aim and a purpose. Like I think of bourgeois ideology and working class ideology. Bourgeois ideology is pushing to divide people, to isolate people, to weaken them, and to take away their power. Whereas working class ideology seeks to empower working class people, to unify them, to empower them with knowledge and education, with skills and talents. Um, so yeah, I hope I'm
No,
answering the question.
yeah, absolutely. That yeah, the base our ideology, right, is the how we understand our place the in society and our interests and our role, and that's very different based on whether we're using an ideology that, right, is like you said, you know, projected onto us from the capitalist class, or whether we're developing a working class one. So Marx, kind of, you know, I don't know if I'm supposed to cite Marx or not, since we're talking about how jargony theory is, but so Marx wrote, material force has to be overthrown by material force. He's talking about the battle of ideas in the larger context of social change and revolution. Material force must be overthrown by material force, but theory becomes a material force when it moves the masses. David, can you de-jargonify that for us and
I
tell what is Marx on about?
Yeah, I think this is a great quote to bring up. So, I think Marx's point is that the ideas that people have in their heads manifest in their actions in the world. So I want to, again, in the spirit of de-jargonifying, let's like take that and put it into practical terms. So what it makes me think of is sort of the growing movement on climate change and the mass protests that we see building over the last several decades on climate. This is based on ideas, on scientific practice that showed us that the climate was changing and that humans were the ones changing it through industrial activity. That isn't obvious from looking out into the world. I mean, we all see some evidence of that, but it's something that had to be studied scientifically, not just, measured with instruments and through experimentation. And that created ideas, and then people acted on those ideas, and it became a force for change in the world. So there's a direct relationship between, yeah, the practice of science, the development of ideas, and then implementing those ideas in action. I think that's what Marx was speaking to, is the potential for the ideas of scientific socialism to translate into people's actions in the world. And he spent his life laying out the path for how those ideas translate into practice.
Thank you. And I was wondering if maybe Brooklyn, you could speak to how that is different from the sort of focus on, um, like, so if we look at the way that a lot of mainstream political work is done, there's this very sort of hyper focus on messaging, right? What's the slogan that's going to resonate with this group or that group? What's the favorability toward this term versus that term? How do we find the thing that's going to, bring in the most people? How is our Marxist vision of sort of ideological work, communication, how is it different from the what we see in capitalist political culture?
Well, I think that we're actually trying to get to an actual answer, or to uh, a way to solve the problem. Whereas I think what you're referring to with like kind of like the capitalist slogans or whatever, they try to take little quotations. I feel like that's meant to kind of make everything super ambiguous, not, it doesn't really mean anything. It's not addressing anything. I mean, we see this a lot of the time with politicians who will kind of walk around and answer when they're asked a question. Whereas I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to give working class people answers to the questions that they have, and the problems that they have. And we're trying to give it to them in a way, that they're able to comprehend. And that also kind of what you were mentioning before about working class people increasingly not having a lot of time, um, giving it to them I hate to use the word simplified, but in a concrete or quick way that so that they're able to apply it and use it um, practically in their lives. And I think that's kind of the difference between what we're trying to do and what capitalist media is trying to do, which is kind of to distract people, to not really give them any real substance, to kind of keep them wondering.
Yeah, that sort of marketing kind of approach. And that sort of, I think what you were saying connects back to what Bobby said earlier about when you use the term surplus value, it deserves a paragraph, right? It's an important concept. It's a tool for people to make sense of their lives. I think Bobby at one point told me that you can have one uh, theoretical concept per article, like there, because I have a tendency to kind of go overboard, but I think it was a good point, right? That you know pick one thing that people might not understand and explain that thing without introducing a whole bunch of other things that have to be explained. And I thought that was a really good uh, a good piece of advice. I wonder, we're approaching the end of our program here, and this has been a great conversation. I wonder if maybe just to round it out, we could go around and have folks share some strategies, things you try to keep in mind when you're doing um, uh, your writing, your video production, your social media work. How do you yeah, what advice do you have for other uh, content creators? Maybe starting with Bobby.
Uh, well, I think it's hard work. And if we're writing, then we have to go over it again and again and look at the words and look at the sentences and take away the dependent clauses and make it short, make the sentences short. And, it's, you can't, you can't be lazy. It's a job. The other thing I think that's really challenging to us is how do we get people to, how do we invite people to engage with ideas and manipulate the ideas and own the ideas? Um, so even in teaching a class, is it just you tell all the right answers and then the people take notes and that's it? Or can we get them to really, can we create a situation where people are um, engaging with each other? I guess Marxism was created or started by Marx, but I don't like to think of it as by one philosopher. I think it's something that belongs to our whole class and everybody gets to create it together. It's kind of a joint project. And I'd like to think of it as being created not just in our classrooms or online or in articles, but in the conversations that people have at work and in their neighborhood or at church. Um, and what we can do is um, add some content and some ways of presenting things so that the class as a whole is moving forward. It doesn't just belong to us. And I loved Scott's opening because the theory really belongs to the people who have to uh, carry it out. So when we're having struggles, we're referencing Marxism, whether we use those terminologies. How do we build unity? How do we overcome racism? How do we identify exploitation? All of those things are going on in the day-to-day struggles that we have against immigrant raids and the Starbucks strikes and all of those day-to-day struggles we're in now. We can bring Marxist concepts into it. Thank you.
Thank you, David. What advice do you have for other writers, content creators?
Yeah, there's a lot to say here. We've touched on some of these ideas throughout the course of this conversation, but I think uh, one of the first things is know your audience, know who you're meeting with, who you're talking with, who you're creating that content for. Meet people where they're at, and then build up from there. I don't. you have to think often, about how do people learn, and the kind of the teaching strategy of throw the kid in the deep end of the pool and they'll have to learn how to swim isn't very effective. You need to like build step by step from where people are at. um, so that means knowing your audience, and then that leads me to my other point, which is useful across all of organizing, which is the kind of the famous 80-20 rule, or even 90-10 rule, that you should be listening far more than speaking. So, and I think even in our writing, we reflects that. It should reflect that you've taken in uh, the worker's perspective, or whatever it is that you're covering, that you've taken in a lot of information from the people that can help inform what you're writing about. This isn't something that just springs from within your brain. You're more synthesizing and collecting. Um, so, I think those two things can go a long way. And then, really basic stuff is just keep it short. People are tired. People are working a lot, too much. They're stressed and distracted. I think a short article is far more effective. Just get to the point. Have clarity about what you want to say, and get there quickly and clearly. I think I'd take a 600-word article that is clear and memorable over a long piece just about any day. So yeah, that's a couple things, but it's a learning process. The most important point is to just get started. Try to make something, ask for lots of people's input, as many people as you can get to help you, and that's how you improve, and that's how you ultimately collectively deliver the best content that you can.
Thank you. And Brooklyn, what advice do you have?
I think one of the biggest pieces of advice that I have is that, sometimes it's not necessarily what you're saying, but how you're saying it and how you're talking to people. And I think a lot of the times when we're having these conversations, we shouldn't be talking at people, but more so with people. And I think this was kind of touched on a little bit earlier in the conversation, but basically we can learn as much from the people that we're talking to as they can learn from us, and I feel like these kinds of conversations should be approached that way. And another, I guess, piece of advice that I have is to try to cultivate curiosity with people that we're talking with, because as much as people try to make it seem like people aren't really interested in these complex ideas, or theories. I think that they can be if they're kind of presented these ideas in particular ways. I know that there was a time where I talked about the intimidation before, but I also had experiences where I'm like, well, why would I read that? And then somebody said something where I was like, oh, that is kind of interesting. And then you know you over time you kind of invest more energy into kind of figuring out what's going on. So yeah, I think the biggest piece of advice that I would have would be to talking to people as equals, and not kind of doing that thing where you're being really pretentious and talking down to people and telling them how things are, without really listening to them. But also cultivating a curiosity and making what we're talking about interesting, because it is interesting to people if you present it in the right way.
Yeah, that curiosity is so important, because capitalism pushes that sense of intimidation, which divides us, which prevents us from talking to each other about this stuff. There's something that we sometimes fall into. I think not so much, maybe I'm going to say not so much younger comrades, but sometimes uh, older folks, myself included, fall into this way of talking about the working class and the party, like the party's here and the working class is over there, and we're going to the working class. And how do we approach the working class? How do we talk to the working class? We are part of the working class, and that I think is something that you just brought out, and it's really really important. Like we are talking to people who are in the same situation as us fundamentally. And that's very different from the capitalist idea of education, where you have well, Brooklyn, you brought this out earlier, whether you have an authority who's kind of, trying to talk down to people. And that aspect of just continuing this collective discussion, giving people the tools to understand their world. Uh, any any parting thoughts from any of our panelists? Um,
I think this is a great topic. We should keep talking about it. And, the whole presence of social media, it maybe changes how we need to, you know, offers us ways to communicate that beyond writing articles, sadly for me. But that seems to be where people engage with a lot of ideas. So how do we do that?
yeah, we should maybe at some point do an episode on, um, how the new challenges posed by like short form content and everything, or something like that. Any other last thoughts people want to get in?
I also just really appreciate the conversation. I've mentioned it. I'll mention it again. Just, sometimes I do get really intimidated, but it's conversations like this where we kind of open up our minds to including everybody in these kinds of conversations that, make me feel like I'm taking another step forward. And I hope, this conversation encourages other people to feel a little bit more confident in contributing to conversations, larger conversations.
Thank you. It has been a real pleasure. Um,
Can I add one thing?
yeah,
Ideas
absolutely.
always go better with food. So if you want
Yes.
to have a conversation with somebody, do it over a meal or bring something or they bring something. I think there's something in that makes people open to sharing ideas.
Absolutely. No, it's not just about finding the right words, it's about creating the right context and the right situation.
Recipes, yeah.
Yep.
The right recipes, the best snacks. Communists have the best snacks. Um, I think with that, comrades, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, share Good Morning Revolution, share the wealth, as Joe says, and stay strong, stay safe, and stay in the fight. Talk to you later.